I found my husband's 20-year-old assistant sprawled across my living room sofa that humid August morning when Madison looked at me with those emerald eyes and announced she was moving into our penthouse because David had chosen her over me. I thought my marriage had ended, but by midnight, she would discover what it truly means to build dreams on quicksand. The marble floors of our downtown Chicago penthouse felt cold beneath my bare feet as I stood frozen in the doorway, still clutching my morning coffee. Madison Sterling, all honey blonde hair and designer confidence, had made herself comfortable on our Italian leather sectional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her perfectly manicured fingers trailing across the armrest like she was already measuring for new furniture. She couldn't have been more than 21, with the kind of flawless skin that spoke of expensive facials and a trust fund upbringing. Her outfit alone, a cream-colored Hermès blazer paired with Louboutin heels, probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The contrast between us couldn't have been starker, me in my silk pajamas and messy bun, hair still tousled from sleep, and her looking like she'd stepped off a magazine cover at 7 in the morning. Our penthouse, 30 floors above Lake Michigan, had always been my sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the water, while the carefully curated art collection and custom furnishings reflected 15 years of building a life together. Today, that same space felt violated, contaminated by her presence, and the casual way she examined everything as if appraising future purchases. "I'm sorry to surprise you like this, Mrs. Hayes," Madison said, her voice carrying that particular mix of false sympathy and barely concealed triumph that only comes with youth and perceived victory. "But David thought it would be better if I came to explain the situation personally." The audacity took my breath away. David's assistant, the same girl who'd joined Meridian Capital just 8 months ago, fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA and enough family connections to secure a position in my husband's private equity firm, was sitting in my home, discussing my marriage like it was a business transaction she was facilitating. "How considerate of you both," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. 23 years as a forensic accountant had taught me to maintain composure even when examining the financial wreckage of collapsed companies. Those same skills were serving me well now, as I studied Madison's confident posture and the expensive accessories that surrounded her like armor. She shifted slightly, crossing her legs with practiced elegance, clearly expecting a different reaction. Where were the tears, the hysteria, the dramatic confrontation she'd undoubtedly rehearsed in her mind? "David's been planning this for months," she continued, her voice gaining strength from my apparent calm. "He knows it's sudden, but we're moving to the Cayman Islands next week. He's purchased a villa there, oceanfront, completely private. We can start fresh, away from all the complications here." Cayman Islands. The words hit me like ice water. I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was already racing. David had always handled our personal finances, claiming his expertise in international investments made him better suited for managing our wealth. I'd been content to focus on my own thriving forensic accounting practice, trusting that the man I'd built a life with was building our future responsibly. "That sounds lovely," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee while studying her face. "International moves can be so expensive. I hope David has everything properly arranged." Something flickered in Madison's eyes, uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same confident smile. "Oh, David handles all of that. He's been liquidating assets, consolidating everything offshore. Smart financial planning, really. We'll be completely set up before we arrive." Liquidating assets, consolidating offshore. The terminology was right, but something about the way she said it, like she was reciting phrases she'd memorized without understanding their true implications, set off every professional instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of investigating financial fraud. "I see you've given this considerable thought," I observed, walking to the kitchen island and setting down my mug with deliberate precision. "David's always been meticulous about financial planning." Madison's smile widened, mistaking my tone for defeat. "He really is brilliant with money. The way he's structured everything, the offshore accounts, the asset transfers, the timing of the move, It's all perfectly coordinated. We won't want for anything. I nodded slowly, filing away each detail she volunteered. Asset transfers, offshore coordination, timing that coincided with an immediate international relocation. Either David had become remarkably sophisticated in his financial planning, or Madison was describing something else entirely, something that sounded disturbingly like the preliminary stages of financial flight I'd seen countless times in my professional work. "And your position at Meridian?" I asked. "I assume you'll be transitioning your responsibilities before the move." She waved a dismissive hand, the gesture highlighting a tennis bracelet that glittered with what appeared to be substantial diamonds. "Oh, I resigned yesterday. David said there was no point in maintaining the pretense anymore. Besides, after we're married, I won't need to work." The pieces were falling into place with crystalline clarity. Madison had quit her job, invested in expensive jewelry and clothing, and was planning an international move based entirely on David's assurances about their financial future. She was operating with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to inherit a life of luxury. "When is the wedding?" I asked, genuinely curious about how deep this deception ran. "Next month in Grand Cayman. David's already made all the arrangements, the resort, the photographer, everything. He said it would be easier to start our new life if we made it official right away." I absorbed this information, noting how perfectly it aligned with someone's need to establish foreign residency and potentially claim spousal privilege in international legal proceedings. Madison interpreted my silence as resignation, her confidence reaching its peak. "I know this is difficult," she said, rising from the sofa with fluid grace. "But David and we have something special, something worth starting over for." I watched her gather her designer purse, studying the way she moved through my home with such assurance, already seeing herself as its future owner. She had no idea that the foundation of her dreams was about to prove far less solid than the marble beneath our feet. "Madison," I called as she headed toward the door. She turned back, eyebrows raised expectantly. "You might want to have your own financial advisor review David's offshore arrangements before you make any permanent moves." Her laugh was light, dismissive. "That's sweet, but David handles everything. I trust him completely." As the door closed behind her, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Some conversations couldn't wait, and some investigations needed to begin immediately. The game was about to change, and Madison Sterling had no idea what she'd just walked into. After Madison left, I stood in the sudden silence of my penthouse, the morning light streaming through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny fragments of my shattered assumptions. The Lake Michigan view that had always calmed me now felt like a backdrop to a stage where I'd been performing in a play, without knowing the script had changed. My name is Avery Hayes, and for 23 years, I've built my reputation as one of Chicago's most respected forensic accountants. Companies call me when their numbers don't add up, when executives have been creative with their bookkeeping, or when bankruptcy courts need someone to trace assets that have mysteriously vanished. I've unraveled Ponzi schemes, exposed embezzlement rings, and followed money trails through labyrinthine offshore structures that would make a thriller novelist proud. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my career following other people's money while apparently being blind to my own. David and I met at Northwestern's business school 17 years ago. He was the charismatic MBA student who could charm professors and classmates alike, while I was the quiet CPA candidate who spent Friday nights in the library mastering forensic accounting techniques. Our differences had seemed complementary then, his vision and networking skills paired with my analytical precision and attention to detail. After graduation, David launched his career in private equity, while I built my forensic accounting practice from the ground up. Hayes Financial Investigations started in a shared office space above a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Today, my firm occupies an entire floor of a prestigious Loop building, with 12 employees and a client roster that includes Fortune 500 companies and federal agencies. David's trajectory had been equally impressive, or so I'd believed. Meridian Capital, the private equity firm he'd joined straight out of business school, had promoted him steadily. 5 years ago, he'd been named managing partner, overseeing investments in emerging markets and technology startups. His success had funded our lifestyle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The penthouse, the vacation home in Aspen, the collection of luxury cars that filled our underground garage. I'd been proud of what we'd built together, even as our careers pulled us in different directions. David traveled constantly, chasing deals in Silicon Valley, Austin, and international markets. I was equally busy, often spending weeks at client sites reconstructing financial records and preparing testimony for complex litigation. We'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm of parallel success, intersecting at charity galas, weekend getaways, and quiet dinners when our schedules aligned. The warning signs had been subtle, easy to dismiss amid the chaos of two demanding careers. David's travel had increased over the past year, with longer stays in the Cayman Islands where Meridian had established a subsidiary. He'd become more secretive about his phone calls, stepping onto the balcony when certain clients called. His appetite for expensive purchases had grown: the Rolex Submariner, the vintage Porsche, the art acquisitions that he'd insisted were investments in our future. Most telling in retrospect was his sudden interest in consolidating our finances. 6 months ago, he'd suggested transferring my investment accounts to his management, claiming he could achieve better returns through Meridian's international strategies. I declined, preferring to maintain my own portfolio, but he'd persisted with an intensity that had surprised me. Madison Sterling had appeared in our lives 8 months ago, ostensibly hired for her MBA credentials and family connections in the tech industry. She was Richard Sterling's daughter. Sterling Technologies was one of Meridian's portfolio companies, which had made her hiring seem like a strategic move to strengthen client relationships. David had mentioned her occasionally, always in professional terms, praising her analytical skills and fresh perspectives on emerging markets. I'd met her exactly twice before this morning. Once at Meridian's holiday party, where she'd been polite but unmemorable, and again at a charity auction where she'd bid aggressively on a weekend in Martha's Vineyard that sold for $45,000. Even then, I'd wondered how a recent MBA graduate could afford such extravagances, but David had mentioned something about trust fund wealth that made it seem reasonable. Now, replaying those encounters with new knowledge, I could see the signs I'd missed. The way Madison had studied our penthouse during the holiday party, asking detailed questions about the renovation and the art collection, her casual inquiries about our travel plans and David's business schedule, the confidence with which she'd moved through spaces that should have felt foreign to someone so young. At 42, I'd built my life on facts, evidence, and logical analysis. Emotions were useful data points, but decisions were made based on verifiable information and careful planning. This methodical approach had served me well professionally, helping me uncover fraud patterns that others missed and build court cases that stood up to aggressive cross-examination. But somewhere along the way, I'd applied the same analytical distance to my marriage. I'd noticed David's changes but filed them away as career stress or midlife adjustment. I'd seen the financial inconsistencies but attributed them to his sophisticated investment strategies. I'd observed Madison's behavior but categorized it as ambitious networking rather than strategic seduction. The phone in my hand buzzed with a text message from my assistant. Mrs. Patterson's deposition moved to 2 p.m. Need the Hartwell files by noon. Normal life continuing while my personal world reorganized itself around new realities. I walked to the kitchen and poured another cup of coffee, my movements automatic while my mind processed the implications of Madison's visit. She'd revealed more than she'd intended, painting a picture of hasty liquidation, offshore transfers, and international relocation that bore no resemblance to legitimate financial planning. David might be charming and visionary, but I was the one with 23 years of experience tracking financial deception. Madison might be young and beautiful, but she was also naive enough to trust a man whose recent behavior suggested he was either planning massive tax evasion or preparing for financial flight. As I looked out at Lake Michigan, the water calm and reflective in the morning light, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days building my practice: the thrill of a complex investigation beginning to unfold. Madison Sterling thought she was inheriting a fortune. David Hayes thought he was executing a perfect escape plan. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd spent her career proving that money always leaves a trail, and that trail always leads to the truth. The number I dialed belonged to Marcus Chen, my former colleague at Grant Thornton, and now one of Chicago's most skilled private investigators specializing in financial crimes. We'd worked together on dozens of cases over the past decade, and Marcus had an uncanny ability to uncover information that others missed. Avery, Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar blend of professionalism and genuine warmth. Please tell me you're calling about the Morrison case and not because you need my services personally. I wish I could, I replied, walking to my home office and powering up my laptop. Marcus, I need you to run a comprehensive financial background check on someone, discreetly and quickly. The pause on his end told me he understood the gravity of my request. Who are we looking at? David Hayes. My husband. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus had attended our wedding, had shared countless dinners at this very penthouse. Avery, what's happened? I gave him the abbreviated version of Madison's visit, focusing on the financial details that had raised red flags. As I spoke, I pulled up David's recent credit card statements on our shared account, scanning for patterns I might have missed. Cayman Islands relocation, asset liquidation, and a 20-year-old assistant who's already quit her job, based on promised wealth. Marcus summarized, that's either the world's most expensive midlife crisis, or something much more serious. My thoughts exactly. How quickly can you get me preliminary findings? Give me 4 hours for the basics, credit reports, recent transactions, any obvious red flags. Full workup will take longer, but I can tell you by this afternoon if your instincts are correct. After ending the call with Marcus, I opened my laptop and began my own investigation. David might control our joint accounts, but I had my own resources and 23 years of experience in following financial breadcrumbs. I started with public records, searching for any recent property transactions, business filings, or legal documents bearing David's name. What I found made my coffee grow cold as I stared at the screen. 3 weeks ago, David had filed incorporation papers for Hayes International Holdings, with a Cayman Islands address. The filing listed him as sole director and shareholder, with business purposes broadly defined as investment management and international financial services. More troubling, the registered agent was a firm I recognized from previous investigations, one that specialized in helping clients establish anonymous offshore entities. Next, I accessed our joint investment account through the online portal. David had convinced me years ago to give him trading authorization for tax efficiency purposes, though I'd maintained viewing access. The account balance made me grip the edge of my desk. Where there should have been $2.3 million in diversified investments, there was now $847,000, and most of that was in highly speculative cryptocurrency positions. Over the past 6 months, David had systematically liquidated our blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and real estate investment trusts, converting everything to digital assets that could be moved instantly across international borders. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled through the transaction history. Each sale had been perfectly legal. David had full authority to make these trades. But the pattern was unmistakable. He was converting our stable, traceable assets into forms that could disappear at the click of a button. I called our mortgage company next, speaking to a representative about the status of our penthouse loan. What I learned sent ice through my veins. Mrs. Hayes, I show that Mr. Hayes contacted us 2 weeks ago about accelerating the payoff process, the representative explained. He indicated you'd be refinancing with an offshore institution and wanted to clear the existing mortgage. We're currently preparing the payoff documentation he requested. How much is the current balance? $1.8 million, ma'am. Mr. Hayes mentioned he'd be providing a wire transfer from his Cayman Islands account within the next 2 weeks. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence, pieces of David's plan crystallizing with horrifying clarity. He wasn't just having an affair, he was systematically dismantling our entire financial life and preparing to vanish with whatever he could liquidate. Madison's visit wasn't a courtesy call from the other woman. It was reconnaissance. She'd been sent to gauge my reaction, to determine how much time they had before I discovered what was happening. Her confident assumption about inheriting wealth wasn't naive optimism. It was based on David's assurances that he was liquidating millions in marital assets. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. David's name appeared on the screen. Avery, he said when I answered, his voice carrying forced casualness. Madison mentioned she stopped by this morning. I hope she was respectful about the situation. She was very informative, I replied, keeping my tone neutral while scrolling through more transaction records. She seems quite excited about your upcoming move to the Cayman Islands. A brief pause. We should talk about this properly. Are you free for dinner tonight? Somewhere quiet where we can discuss everything like adults. Of course, I agreed. My mind already working. Should I make reservations or do you have somewhere in mind? I'll handle it. 7 o'clock at Aurelio's, our table by the window. Aurelio's, the intimate Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated every anniversary for the past 8 years. Either David was genuinely sentimental about ending our marriage, or he wanted the familiar setting to make his manipulations more effective. I'll see you then, I said, already planning how to use those 8 hours. After ending the call, I opened a new document on my laptop and began creating a timeline of David's financial activities over the past year. Every transaction, every new account, every suspicious pattern would be documented with forensic precision. David thought he was executing the perfect escape plan. Madison thought she was about to become wealthy beyond her dreams. They had both made a critical error. They'd underestimated the woman who'd spent her career proving that money never truly disappears. It just changes form, and those forms always leave traces. By dinner time, I would know exactly how much they planned to steal, and I would be ready to ensure they got exactly what they deserved. Marcus called back at 2:47 p.m., exactly 4 hours after our initial conversation. I was in my office at Hayes Financial Investigations, having spent the morning canceling client meetings and rearranging my schedule. Some discoveries couldn't wait for convenient timing. Avery, you need to sit down, Marcus said without preamble. Your husband isn't just planning to leave you, he's been systematically defrauding Meridian Capital for at least 18 months. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline through my office windows. Tell me everything. David's been using his position to redirect client investments into shell companies he controls. The amounts are staggering. I'm seeing at least $15 million in misappropriated funds, possibly more. He's been creating fake investment opportunities, collecting management fees, then moving the money through a network of offshore accounts. My stomach dropped. This was far worse than marital infidelity or even personal financial flight. David was committing securities fraud on a massive scale. There's more, Marcus continued. The Cayman Islands company you mentioned, it's not just a vehicle for hiding assets, it's the centerpiece of an elaborate Ponzi scheme. David's been using new client money to pay returns to existing investors, all while skimming enormous fees for himself. I grabbed a legal pad and began taking notes, my forensic training kicking in despite the personal devastation. How long before it collapses? Soon. Very soon. The math doesn't work anymore. He needs approximately $8 million in new investments this month just to cover promised returns. That's why he's liquidating everything and planning to run. The implications hit me like a physical blow. When David's scheme collapsed, Meridian's clients would lose everything. Pension funds, endowments, individual retirement accounts, all gone because my husband had turned into a financial predator. Marcus, I need you to document everything you've found. Every transaction, every shell company, every fraudulent transfer, and I need it done by 6 o'clock tonight. Avery, what are you planning? I'm going to stop him. After ending the call with Marcus, I immediately dialed Janet Rodriguez, the FBI's white-collar crime division chief in Chicago. Janet and I had worked together on several major fraud cases, and she owed me favors from testimonies that had secured convictions. Avery Hayes, Janet answered, recognizing my number. Please tell me you're calling to testify in another case, and not because you've uncovered something that requires federal intervention. I wish I could. Janet, I'm about to hand you the biggest securities fraud case Chicago has seen in a decade. But I need your help to prevent the perpetrator from fleeing the country in the next 24 hours. I spent the next 20 minutes walking Janet through David's scheme, explaining how he'd been using Meridian Capital as his personal criminal enterprise. Janet asked sharp questions, her prosecutor instincts immediately grasping the scope and severity of the fraud. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at federal charges for securities fraud, money laundering and wire fraud, Janet said. Multiple counts, each carrying up to 20 years. But Avery, this puts you in an incredibly difficult position legally and personally. I understand the implications. But Janet, there are innocent victims here. Retirees who trusted their life savings to Meridian, charities that invested their endowments. I can't let David steal their futures to fund his escape fantasy. I'll need to coordinate with the SEC and get emergency freeze orders on all associated accounts. Can you meet me at the federal building at 4 p.m.? Bring everything you have. My next call was to Sarah Mitchell, my personal attorney, and one of the sharpest divorce lawyers in Illinois. Sarah had handled several high-profile cases involving financial fraud and asset protection. Avery. Sarah's voice was immediately concerned. I just saw some unusual activity on the legal alert system regarding offshore entities with your husband's name. Please tell me this isn't what I think it is. It's worse than you think, I replied, quickly summarizing the situation. Sarah, I need immediate asset protection and I need David served with divorce papers before he leaves the country. This is going to be complicated given the criminal investigation, but we can work with that. Are you certain you want to proceed this aggressively? Once we file and freeze assets, there's no going back. David crossed that line when he decided to steal from pension funds, file everything today. By 3:30 p.m., I had assembled a war room in my office. Marcus had delivered his preliminary report, 47 pages documenting David's financial crimes with forensic precision. Sarah had drafted emergency divorce papers including asset freezes and restraining orders. Janet was coordinating with federal prosecutors to prepare criminal charges. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. David says dinner tonight is very important. He has big news to share about your future together. I almost laughed at the irony. David planned to use our anniversary dinner to explain how he was abandoning me for a 20-year-old while secretly stealing millions from his clients. Madison was texting me about our future together, while having no idea that her boyfriend was about to become a federal fugitive. But the text gave me an idea, a way to ensure David couldn't escape before law enforcement could act. I typed back, how exciting. I've always admired couples who communicate openly about major life changes. I'm sure tonight will be very memorable for all of us. Let Madison wonder about that cryptic response. By tomorrow morning she would understand exactly what kind of man she'd chosen to trust with her future. As I gathered my files to meet Janet at the federal building, my assistant knocked on my door. Mrs. Hayes, there's a courier here with an urgent delivery for you. The envelope contained a single key and a note in David's handwriting. For our new beginning, all my love, Dee. I recognized the key immediately. It was for a safety deposit box at First National Bank. David's insurance policy, probably containing cash, documents, or other assets he planned to access before fleeing. Perfect. Now I knew exactly where he would go after dinner, and federal agents would be waiting. The game was accelerating faster than David could possibly anticipate. In a few hours, he would sit across from me at our anniversary restaurant, believing he was in control of the situation. He had no idea that while he'd been planning his escape, I'd been building his cage. The federal building's conference room felt sterile under fluorescent lights, as Janet Rodriguez spread David's financial records across the mahogany table. FBI Special Agent Robert Torres sat beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the documents Marcus had compiled. Across from them, I watched their expressions shift from professional interest to genuine alarm as the scope of David's crimes became clear. This is sophisticated, Agent Torres said, pointing to a flowchart Marcus had created showing the money trail. Your husband didn't just wake up one day and decide to commit fraud. This took years of planning and significant technical expertise. Janet nodded, her pen moving rapidly across a legal pad. The shell company structure alone suggests he had help. Professional help. What kind of help? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Someone with deep knowledge of international banking regulations and offshore finance, Torres replied. The way these accounts are structured, Cayman Islands, Singapore, Luxembourg, it's designed to exploit specific gaps in international disclosure requirements. Janet looked up from her notes. Avery, has David ever mentioned working with any financial consultants or advisors outside of Meridian, anyone who might have guided this structure? I thought carefully, replaying conversations from the past 2 years. He mentioned consulting with someone about tax optimization strategies, called him a specialist in international structures. I assumed it was legitimate. Do you remember a name? Vincent, something with a K. Kingston, Kilpatrick. I closed my eyes, concentrating. Vincent Kellerman. David said he was a former Goldman Sachs partner who specialized in helping high-net-worth clients optimize their tax situations. Torres and Janet exchanged glances. Vincent Kellerman, Torres said slowly, is currently under investigation by 3 federal agencies for operating a network of fraudulent investment schemes. He's been helping wealthy clients hide assets and avoid taxes for over a decade. The room seemed to grow colder, so David wasn't working alone. Definitely not, Janet confirmed. This suggests he's part of a larger criminal enterprise. Kellerman typically requires his clients to commit to moving at least $20 million through his network. Your husband's $15 million theft was probably just the down payment. Agent Torres leaned forward. Mrs. Hayes, we need to understand the timeline here. When did David first mention this Kellerman character? I thought back, trying to remember. About 2 years ago, right around the time he started traveling more frequently to the Cayman Islands. He said Kellerman had introduced him to investment opportunities that weren't available through traditional channels. That tracks with our intelligence, Torres said. Kellerman recruits financial professionals who have access to large pools of client money. He provides the technical infrastructure for hiding stolen funds, then takes a percentage of everything that moves through his network. Janet was already typing on her laptop. I'm pulling Kellerman's file now. If David is connected to his operation, this case just became much bigger. She paused, reading something on her screen. Avery, there's something else you need to know. We've been tracking several Meridian Capital employees as potential Kellerman associates. My blood ran cold. How many employees? At least 4, possibly more. This isn't just David going rogue. Kellerman has been systematically infiltrating Meridian for years. The implications hit me like a tsunami. Madison Sterling wasn't just David's mistress. She was potentially part of the criminal conspiracy. Her father's company, Sterling Technologies, was a Meridian portfolio company. Her sudden appearance, her expensive lifestyle, her intimate knowledge of David's plans, it all suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Agent Torres, I said carefully, what do you know about Madison Sterling? Torres flipped through a thick file folder. Richard Sterling's daughter, MBA from Northwestern, joined Meridian 8 months ago. He paused, scanning a document. Interesting. She's been flagged by our financial intelligence unit for unusual banking activity. Large cash deposits that don't match her reported income. How large? $300,000 over the past 6 months. All deposited in amounts just under federal reporting thresholds. Janet looked up sharply. That's classic money laundering behavior. She's not just David's girlfriend, she's his business partner. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Madison's confidence about the Cayman Islands move, her expensive purchases, her detailed knowledge of David's plans. She wasn't the naive young woman I'd assumed. She was a trained MBA with family connections, who'd been carefully positioned to help David steal from Meridian. My blood ran cold. How many employees? At least 4, possibly more. This isn't just David going rogue. Kellerman has been systematically infiltrating Meridian for years. The implications hit me like a tsunami. Madison Sterling wasn't just David's mistress. She was potentially part of the criminal conspiracy. Her father's company, Sterling Technologies, was a Meridian portfolio company. Her sudden appearance, her expensive lifestyle, her intimate knowledge of David's plans, it all suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Agent Torres, I said carefully, what do you know about Madison Sterling? Torres flipped through a thick file folder. Richard Sterling's daughter, MBA from Northwestern, joined Meridian 8 months ago. He paused, scanning a document. Interesting. She's been flagged by our financial intelligence unit for unusual banking activity, large cash deposits that don't match her reported income. How large? $300,000 over the past 6 months, all deposited in amounts just under federal reporting thresholds. Janet looked up sharply. That's classic money laundering behavior. She's not just David's girlfriend, she's his business partner. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Madison's confidence about the Cayman Islands move, her expensive purchases, her detailed knowledge of David's plans. She wasn't the naive young woman I'd assumed. She was a trained MBA with family connections, who'd been carefully positioned to help David steal from Meridian while providing romantic cover for his activities. There's more, Torres continued, reading from another document. Madison Sterling has been in contact with Kellerman's organization for over a year. Phone records show regular calls to known associates. I felt physically sick, so when she came to my penthouse this morning, she was conducting reconnaissance, Janet finished. Trying to determine how much you knew and how much time they had before you discovered the truth. Agent Torres closed the file folder. Mrs. Hayes, your husband isn't planning a romantic escape with his young mistress. He's executing a coordinated criminal conspiracy that could involve dozens of co-conspirators and hundreds of millions in stolen assets. The room fell silent as the full scope of the betrayal settled over me. David hadn't just destroyed our marriage, he'd turned our entire life into a criminal enterprise. Every dinner party at our penthouse, every charity gala we'd attended, every professional relationship we'd built, had potentially been corrupted by his association with Kellerman's network. What happens now? I asked. Janet gathered her papers. Now we set a trap. Your dinner tonight with David becomes a federal operation. We'll wire you with recording equipment and position agents throughout the restaurant. Every word he says will be evidence. And Madison, she'll be under surveillance from the moment she leaves her apartment. If she's planning to flee with David, we'll know about it in real time. Agent Torres stood, his expression grim. Mrs. Hayes, I need you to understand the risks here. If David suspects you're working with law enforcement, he and his associates could become dangerous. Are you prepared to go through with this? I thought about the pension funds David had looted, the retirees who would lose their life savings, the charities that would have to close their doors. Madison might be young and foolish, but she was also a criminal who'd helped orchestrate one of the largest financial frauds in Chicago's history. Agent Torres, I said, standing to face him, my husband destroyed my marriage to fund a criminal conspiracy. His girlfriend isn't a naive young woman. She's a co-conspirator who's been lying to me for months. Yes, I'm prepared to stop them both. In 3 hours, I would sit across from David at our anniversary restaurant, wearing a wire, and pretending everything was normal while federal agents recorded his confession. The man I'd loved for 17 years was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong woman to betray. Aurelio's restaurant felt different at 7 o'clock that evening, though nothing had physically changed. The same warm lighting cast golden shadows across familiar tables, the same subtle jazz played in the background, and our usual corner table by the window still offered the perfect view of Chicago's glittering skyline. But now I sat across from David wearing a wire, surrounded by federal agents posing as diners, about to record evidence that would send my husband to prison for decades. David looked relaxed, almost jubilant as he ordered our usual bottle of Barolo. He'd always been handsome in a polished, corporate way, silver threading through his dark hair, expensive suit perfectly tailored, the kind of confident smile that had charmed investors and colleagues for years. Tonight, that same charm felt predatory. You look beautiful, Avery, he said, reaching. That's what makes it perfect, David replied, taking a sip of wine. The clients see excellent returns on paper. I earn substantial fees and everyone's happy. The only complication is that U.S. regulations make this kind of innovative investing difficult to explain to oversight bodies. Hence the move to the Cayman Islands? Exactly. From there, I can expand the operation without dealing with American bureaucracy. Madison's been invaluable in helping me understand how to structure everything properly. The waiter arrived with our appetizers, providing a natural pause in the conversation. I used the moment to study David's face, searching for any trace of the man I'd married. What I saw was a stranger, someone so consumed by greed that he'd convinced himself that stealing from pension funds was innovative investing. "Tell me about Madison's role in all this," I said once the waiter left. David's expression softened in a way that made my stomach turn. "She's remarkable, Avery. Her father's connections in the tech industry have opened doors I never could have accessed alone, and her understanding of international finance is extraordinary for someone her age. I imagine her MBA education has been helpful. That's part of it, but she's also worked with Vincent Kellerman on several previous projects. He's the one who introduced us to these offshore opportunities." There it was, the connection Agent Torres needed, recorded and admissible in court. David continued, oblivious to the trap he was walking into. "Vincent has been helping high-net-worth individuals optimize their finances for years. He showed me how to create structures that maximize returns while minimizing regulatory exposure. And the timing of your departure? Critical," David said, his voice taking on urgency. "We need to be established in the Caymans before the next SEC review cycle. Some of our strategies might be misunderstood by regulators who don't appreciate innovative approaches to wealth management." I nodded thoughtfully, fighting the urge to scream at his euphemistic language. "What about our assets here? The penthouse, the investments?" "Already handled. I've been liquidating everything and moving it offshore. By the time we relocate, we'll have complete financial independence. Madison and I can start our new life with approximately $20 million in readily accessible funds." $20 million. Agent Torres had estimated David's theft at $15 million, but he'd apparently been conservative. "That's quite a nest egg," I managed. David beamed with pride. "The beauty of working with someone like Vincent is that he understands how to make money work efficiently. Traditional investment approaches are so limiting." Our main courses arrived, and David shifted the conversation to logistics, travel arrangements, property purchases in Grand Cayman, even wedding planning details that made my skin crawl. But he'd already provided everything the FBI needed: admission of securities fraud, acknowledgement of his relationship with Kellerman, confession to money laundering, and detailed descriptions of the criminal conspiracy. As David signaled for the check, his phone buzzed with a text message. "At least 3 additional recent MBA graduates at various investment firms. All connected to wealthy families, all with access to client assets." Torres opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos. Madison wasn't just helping David. She was building a network of young professionals who could infiltrate different firms. The scope of the conspiracy continued to expand. Madison hadn't just seduced my husband, she'd been systematically identifying and recruiting vulnerable targets across Chicago's financial community. Janet's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to take the call. When she returned, her expression was severe. "That was the SEC. They've identified at least 7 other investment firms with suspicious activity patterns that match Kellerman's methodology. This isn't just about Meridian. It's a citywide infiltration." Richard Sterling sank into a nearby chair. "How many people have they victimized?" "We're still calculating, but preliminary estimates suggest over $200 million in client assets have been stolen or compromised," Agent Torres replied. "Your daughter's recruitment efforts were apparently very successful." Through David's office windows, I could see news vans arriving in the street below. Word of the arrests was already spreading through Chicago's financial community. By market close, Meridian Capital would be front-page news for all the wrong reasons. Janet approached me with a legal document. "Avery, the judge has approved the emergency asset freeze you requested. Every account David touched, every property he purchased, every investment he made, all frozen pending the criminal investigation." "What about the client funds?" "That's more complicated. We'll recover what we can, but some of the money has been moved through so many shell companies that it may be impossible to trace. The victims will likely recover only a fraction of their investments." The human cost of David's greed was staggering. Pension funds would collapse, retirees would lose their life savings, charities would close their doors, all so my husband could live in luxury with his 20-year-old accomplice. Agent Torres received a radio communication and turned to us. "David's attorney is here. He's refusing to cooperate and demanding to speak with his client immediately." "Let him," Janet said coldly. "David confessed to multiple federal crimes on tape. His attorney can review the evidence, and explain to him exactly how much trouble he's in. A commotion near the elevators caught our attention. Bradley Morrison, Meridian's senior partner and David's longtime mentor, was arguing with federal agents who were preventing him from accessing his office. "This is outrageous," Morrison shouted. "I've been with this firm for 25 years. I demand to know what's happening." Agent Torres approached Morrison calmly. "Mr. Morrison, we have evidence suggesting you may have knowledge of the fraudulent investment schemes operated by David Hayes. We need to speak with you immediately." Morrison's face went white. "I don't know anything about any schemes. David handled his own client relationships." "Then you won't mind explaining these email exchanges where you discussed alternative investment strategies and offshore optimization opportunities," Torres replied, producing printed emails from an evidence folder. The net was expanding beyond David and Madison. Kellerman's conspiracy had apparently infected multiple levels of Meridian's leadership. As federal agents led Morrison away for questioning, I realized that David's betrayal had been even more comprehensive than I'd imagined. He hadn't just destroyed our marriage and stolen from clients, he'd corrupted an entire firm, recruited accomplices across the industry, and participated in what was becoming the largest financial fraud in Chicago's history. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. Media requests flooding in. Chicago Tribune, Wall Street Journal, CNN all want interviews. How should I respond? I looked around Meridian's executive floor, now crawling with federal agents documenting evidence of systematic criminal activity. David and Madison had believed they were executing the perfect escape plan. Instead, they'd created a crime scene that would dominate headlines for months. By evening, David Hayes would be known throughout Chicago not as a successful private equity executive, but as the mastermind of a massive Ponzi scheme. Madison Sterling would be famous not as a promising young MBA, but as a criminal recruiter who'd helped victimize hundreds of innocent investors. And I would be known as the forensic accountant who'd brought them both down. The reckoning was just beginning. The Cook County Federal Detention Center felt surreal as I signed in for the attorney-client meeting 2 days after David's arrest. Although I wasn't his lawyer, the rules allowed spousal visits, and I needed to hear the truth directly from him, not the sanitized version his attorney would eventually present to prosecutors. David appeared smaller in the orange jumpsuit, his usual corporate polish stripped away by 48 hours in federal custody. His silver hair was disheveled, his confident demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose world had collapsed overnight. "Avery," he said, quietly as the guard secured his handcuffs to the metal table between us. "I didn't expect you to come. I needed to understand," I replied, studying his face for any trace of remorse. "The David I married couldn't have done what you've done. I need to know when you became someone else." He was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness I'd never heard before. "It started 3 years ago. Meridian was struggling. Tech bubble burst. Several major deals fell through. Our client returns were below market, and we were hemorrhaging assets under management." He looked up at me. "I was terrified of failing, of losing everything we'd built. So you decided to steal instead." "It wasn't supposed to be stealing," David said quickly. "Vincent Kellerman approached me at a conference in Miami. He had this system, offshore investment vehicles that could generate guaranteed returns. He said dozens of fund managers were using his strategies to boost performance." I kept my expression neutral, though I wanted to scream. "Tell me about Madison." David's face flushed with something that might have been shame. "Vincent brought her in 18 months ago, said she was a specialist in recruitment and client relations. Young, smart, connected to wealthy families who could provide new capital. And you fell for her immediately." "It wasn't like that, not at first." David rubbed his forehead, the handcuffs clanking against the table. "She was brilliant, Avery. Her analysis of market trends, her understanding of regulatory gaps, she made everything seem legitimate, sophisticated. When did it become personal? Last year, she started staying late, helping me structure the more complex transactions. We'd work until midnight, grab dinner, talk about building something revolutionary in the financial industry." He paused. "She made me feel like we were pioneers, not criminals." The manipulation was clearer now. Madison hadn't seduced my husband, she'd recruited him into a criminal enterprise, then used romance to ensure his loyalty and silence. David, did you ever question where her expertise came from, how a 20-year-old MBA knew so much about offshore finance? I asked once. She said her father had trained her from childhood to understand international business structures. It seemed plausible given Sterling Technologies' global operations. I leaned forward. What did you think when she started making expensive purchases? The jewelry, the designer clothes, the luxury lifestyle. She said her family trust had matured, that she'd inherited a substantial sum. David's voice grew quieter. I wanted to believe it because it made everything feel more legitimate. If she had family wealth, then our relationship couldn't be about money. But it was always about money. David nodded slowly. The federal agents showed me her real financial records during interrogation. Every expensive purchase was funded by commissions from Kellerman's network. She was being paid based on how much money she could help steal. The revelation hung between us like a physical weight. Madison's entire persona, the wealthy heiress, the brilliant analyst, the young woman in love, had been an elaborate fiction designed to facilitate financial crime. How much did you steal, David? Total amount. 24 million, he whispered. I thought we were investing it in legitimate offshore opportunities. Vincent provided documentation showing excellent returns, but he trailed off. But the returns were fake, completely fabricated. The money went into Vincent's accounts, then got distributed to his network of accomplices. Madison's commissions, luxury lifestyle expenses, payments to other recruiters. I felt sick thinking about the retirees and charities who'd trusted their futures to Meridian. What about the other firms Madison was recruiting from? She never told me specifics, but Vincent mentioned they had associates at Goldman, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, all the major players. She was part of a coordinated effort to infiltrate Chicago's entire financial community, and you never questioned the ethics of what you were doing. David finally met my eyes. Every day. But Madison would show me the fabricated performance reports, talk about how we were helping clients achieve extraordinary returns, remind me that offshore investing was perfectly legal for sophisticated investors. He paused. She made it easy to ignore my conscience. What happens now? My attorney says federal prosecutors are offering plea deals to anyone who cooperates fully. Reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against Vincent and the other network participants. Are you going to cooperate? I don't have a choice. The evidence is overwhelming, and they've promised to pursue the maximum sentences for anyone who doesn't help them dismantle Vincent's entire operation. A guard appeared at the door, signaling that our time was ending. As David prepared to return to his cell, he looked at me with something approaching his old self. Avery, I know I destroyed everything between us, but I need you to know what Madison and I had wasn't real. None of it was real. She was playing a role, and I was too stupid and greedy to see it. I stood to leave, feeling oddly empty rather than vindicated. David, the tragedy isn't that Madison was lying to you. The tragedy is that you were willing to steal from innocent people regardless of her motivations. As I walked away from the detention center, my phone rang. Agent Torres. Avery, we've arrested Vincent Kellerman at Miami International Airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Switzerland with $50 million in cryptocurrency wallets. Torres paused. We need your help with something else. Madison is claiming she was manipulated by David, that she didn't understand the criminal nature of their activities. That's absurd. She was collecting commissions based on stolen assets. We know that, but she's young, attractive, and her attorney is painting her as a naive victim of an older, more sophisticated criminal. The jury might buy it unless we can prove her active participation in the conspiracy. I thought about Madison's confident demeanor in my penthouse, her detailed knowledge of David's plans, her expensive lifestyle funded by criminal proceeds. Agent Torres, what do you need me to do? Help us demonstrate that Madison Sterling was never a victim. Help us prove she was the architect of her own criminal enterprise. The final phase of justice was about to begin. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago buzzed with activity as Madison Sterling's trial entered its third week. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching as Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Rodriguez methodically dismantled Madison's defense of naive victimhood. Madison looked younger than her 21 years in the conservative navy suit her attorney had chosen, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup emphasizing her youthful appearance. It was a calculated image designed to convince the jury that she was an innocent girl manipulated by older, more sophisticated criminals. The strategy might have worked if not for the evidence Janet had painstakingly assembled over the past 3 months. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Janet said, approaching the witness stand where Madison's Northwestern Business School professor sat nervously, "I want you to hear about the real Madison Sterling, not the victim her defense attorney has portrayed, but the calculated criminal who orchestrated one of the most sophisticated recruitment schemes in federal crime history." Professor Linda Martinez adjusted her glasses, clearly uncomfortable with testifying against a former student. "Madison was exceptional in my international finance course. Her final project analyzed offshore tax avoidance strategies with a level of sophistication I rarely see in graduate students. Can you describe the specific focus of her research?" "She studied how wealthy individuals could exploit gaps in international banking regulations to hide assets from tax authorities. Her analysis was brilliant, but deeply troubling from an ethical standpoint." Janet introduced Madison's academic work as evidence, 43 pages of detailed analysis, showing exactly how to structure criminal financial schemes, the same techniques David had used to steal from Meridian's clients. Professor Martinez, did Madison ever express concerns about the ethical implications of these strategies? Just the opposite. During class discussions, she argued that sophisticated investors had a responsibility to maximize returns regardless of regulatory constraints. She said traditional ethical considerations were obstacles to financial innovation. From the defense table, Madison's attorney objected, but the damage was clear. This wasn't a naive young woman stumbling into crime. This was someone who'd spent months researching the exact criminal techniques she would later implement. Janet's next witness was FBI forensic accountant Dr. Robert Kim, who'd analyzed Madison's financial records going back to her college years. "Dr. Kim, what did your analysis reveal about Miss Sterling's income and expenses over the past 2 years?" Miss Sterling received approximately $847,000 in commission payments from Vincent Kellerman's organization, paid through a series of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. Janet displayed a chart showing Madison's commission structure. "Can you explain how these payments were calculated?" "They were based on the amount of client assets her recruits successfully transferred to Kellerman's network. For every $1 million stolen, Miss Sterling received a 5% commission." The jury's faces showed shock as the numbers sank in. Madison hadn't just helped David steal, she'd been paid based on the scale of the theft. "Dr. Kim, did Miss Sterling take steps to conceal these payments?" "Extensive steps. She used multiple bank accounts, cash deposits below federal reporting thresholds, and cryptocurrency conversions to hide the source of her income. These are sophisticated money laundering techniques." Janet introduced evidence showing Madison's lifestyle expenses: $67,000 for designer clothing, $43,000 for jewelry, $89,000 for luxury travel, all funded by commissions from stolen pension funds and charitable endowments. The prosecution's most devastating witness was Thomas Chen, no relation to my ex-husband, a young analyst at Goldman Sachs, who Madison had recruited into Kellerman's network. "Mr. Chen, how did you first meet the defendant?" "At a Northwestern alumni event last year. Madison approached me, said she was interested in my work in emerging markets. She was very charming, very knowledgeable about international finance. What happened next? She invited me to dinner, then to several social events. Over a few weeks, she gradually brought up investment opportunities that weren't available through traditional channels." Thomas's voice was heavy with regret. "She made it sound innovative and exciting." "Did Miss Sterling explain the source of these opportunities?" "She said she worked with sophisticated investors who had access to offshore strategies that generated extraordinary returns. She showed me documentation that looked completely legitimate." Janet displayed the fabricated investment reports Madison had used to recruit Thomas. "What did she ask you to do?" "Transfer client assets to these offshore investment vehicles. She said Goldman's compliance department was too conservative, that we were limiting our clients' potential returns by following outdated regulations." "How much money did you transfer before discovering the scheme was fraudulent?" Thomas's voice broke slightly. $12 million. Pension funds for Chicago teachers and firefighters. Madison's attorney tried damage control during cross-examination, suggesting Thomas was shifting blame to avoid responsibility for his own crimes. But Thomas had cooperated fully with federal investigators, providing detailed records of Madison's recruitment techniques and commission payments. The trial's climax came when Janet called Vincent Kellerman as a witness. The mastermind of the entire conspiracy had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, though he still faced 15 years in federal prison. Mr. Kellerman, how did you recruit Miss Sterling into your organization? I didn't recruit her, Kellerman said calmly. She recruited herself. Madison contacted me through intermediaries, proposing a systematic infiltration of Chicago's financial community using young professionals with family connections. The courtroom fell silent. Madison's own attorney looked shocked. Miss Sterling proposed this strategy, entirely her initiative. She understood that young, attractive professionals could gain access to senior executives more easily than traditional criminal associates. Her recruitment plan was brilliant. Janet introduced emails between Madison and Kellerman dating back 2 years, months before she'd met David. The messages showed Madison researching targets, analyzing firm structures, and calculating potential theft amounts with clinical precision. Mr. Kellerman, in your professional opinion, was Miss Sterling a victim or a criminal mastermind? Madison Sterling was one of the most sophisticated criminal minds I've ever encountered. She wasn't manipulated by anyone, she was the one doing the manipulating. As Kellerman's testimony concluded, I watched Madison's carefully constructed facade finally crack. Her youthful innocence dissolved, replaced by cold calculation as she realized her defense had collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, money laundering, securities fraud, and criminal conspiracy. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Judge Patricia Walsh was unforgiving. Miss Sterling, you have shown exceptional talent and intelligence. You could have built a legitimate career helping people achieve financial security. Instead, you chose to systematically steal from teachers, firefighters, and retirees to fund your luxury lifestyle. 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Madison Sterling, the young woman who'd sat in my penthouse announcing her bright future, would spend the next 2 decades behind bars. Justice, it seemed, had its own sense of timing. 6 months after Madison's sentencing, I stood in the empty penthouse that had once been my home, watching movers carry the last of my belongings toward the elevator. The space felt hollow now, stripped of the artwork and furniture that had made it feel like a sanctuary. Every room held memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The penthouse had sold within a week of listing, purchased by a tech entrepreneur who'd apparently always admired the building. The proceeds, $3.8 million after legal fees and taxes, would fund the next chapter of my life, though I was still determining what that chapter would look like. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the therapist I'd been seeing since David's arrest. Remember, rebuilding isn't about returning to who you were. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. Sound advice, though easier said than implemented. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and professional upheaval. Hayes Financial Investigations had become Chicago's most sought-after forensic accounting firm, with clients specifically requesting the woman who'd exposed the Kellerman conspiracy. My staff had tripled, my revenue had quadrupled, and my reputation had evolved from respected professional to nationally recognized expert. But success felt hollow when measured against the personal wreckage David had left behind. The elevator arrived, and I took one final look at the living room where Madison had announced her plans to steal my life. The morning light streaming through the windows looked the same, but everything else had changed fundamentally. That naive woman who'd stood frozen with her coffee cup was gone, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more careful about trusting others. My new townhouse in Lincoln Park felt like a fresh start, smaller than the penthouse but warmer, with exposed brick walls and original hardwood floors that spoke of history and resilience. I'd chosen it specifically because it bore no resemblance to the life I'd shared with David. As I unpacked boxes in my new home office, I found a folder of newspaper clippings my assistant had compiled. The headlines told the story of the past year. Kellerman Network sentenced. Madison Sterling gets 22 years. Chicago's largest financial fraud exposed. David's name appeared in most articles, but always as a secondary figure, a mid-level executive manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. The truth was more complex. David had been genuinely manipulated by Madison and Kellerman, but he'd also made conscious choices to prioritize greed over ethics. His 18-year federal sentence reflected that complexity, substantial punishment tempered by cooperation and acknowledged victimization. I'd received a letter from him the previous month, forwarded through my attorney, 2 pages of handwritten remorse, asking for forgiveness I wasn't sure I could provide. David claimed that federal prison had given him clarity about his choices, that he understood now how thoroughly Madison had manipulated his emotions and judgment. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps Madison's psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that even a successful businessman couldn't recognize it. But David's vulnerability to that manipulation had revealed character flaws I'd somehow missed during 17 years of marriage. My doorbell rang, interrupting my unpacking. Through the window I could see Janet Rodriguez holding a bottle of wine and wearing casual clothes, a rare sight given her typically formal prosecutorial demeanor. "Congratulations on the new place," Janet said as I opened the door. "I brought champagne to celebrate your fresh start." We settled in my partially furnished living room, surrounded by moving boxes and the comfortable chaos of relocation. Janet had become an unexpected friend during the investigation and trials, our shared commitment to justice creating a bond that had survived the conclusion of the criminal cases. "How are you really doing?" Janet asked, studying my face with the same intensity she'd used to examine witnesses. "Better than expected, worse than I'd hoped," I admitted. "Some days I feel strong and independent, like I've reclaimed my life. Other days I feel angry and betrayed in ways I didn't know were possible. That's normal for anyone who's experienced systematic deception. David and Madison didn't just lie to you, they constructed an entire false reality around you." I nodded, sipping the champagne and thinking about Dr. Reeves's frequent reminders that healing wasn't linear. The hardest part is trusting my own judgment again. If I could miss criminal behavior in my own husband, how can I trust my instincts about anything else? "By remembering that you did catch them," Janet pointed out. "Your professional instincts recognized the fraud patterns immediately. It was your personal emotions that created blind spots, and that's human." We talked for 2 hours about rebuilding, about the difference between forgiveness and healing, about the strange position of being simultaneously a victim and a hero in the same story. Janet's perspective as a prosecutor gave her insights into how people recovered from massive betrayals, while my experience as a forensic accountant had taught me that truth always emerged eventually, no matter how deeply buried. As Janet prepared to leave, she mentioned something that caught my attention. "Avery, have you given any thought to teaching? Northwestern's business school has been asking about guest lectures on forensic accounting and financial ethics." The idea intrigued me, teaching young professionals about the warning signs of financial crime, about the importance of ethical decision-making, about the real-world consequences of choices that seemed abstract in textbooks. "You think I have something valuable to offer?" "I think you have exactly what business students need to hear: real experience with how easily good people can become criminals when they prioritize short-term gain over long-term integrity." After Janet left, I sat in my new living room thinking about the future I wanted to build. Hayes Financial Investigations would continue growing, helping other victims recover from financial crimes. But perhaps there was room for something more: education, prevention, building the next generation of ethical financial professionals. My phone buzzed with an email from Northwestern's dean, inviting me to discuss a potential partnership between the business school and my firm, a program focused on practical ethics in financial services, taught by someone who'd seen firsthand how quickly success could become corruption. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about the future, rather than simply relieved to have survived the past. David and Madison had stolen my marriage and betrayed my trust, but they hadn't destroyed my capacity to build something meaningful from the wreckage. The best revenge, I was learning, wasn't punishment, it was becoming stronger than they'd ever imagined possible. 1 year later, I stood before a packed auditorium at Northwestern's business school, looking out at 200 MBA students who represented the future of American finance. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was teaching in the same building where David and I had met, where Madison had earned her degree, where the seeds of the Kellerman conspiracy had likely been planted. Financial ethics isn't an abstract concept, I began, clicking to a slide showing newspaper headlines from the Kellerman trials. It's a daily choice between personal gain and professional integrity, and as you'll learn today, those choices have consequences that extend far beyond your own careers. The Hayes Institute for Financial Ethics had officially launched 6 months earlier, a partnership between Northwestern's business school and my forensic accounting firm. What had started as guest lectures had evolved into a comprehensive program that was attracting attention from universities nationwide. In the front row sat Maria Santos, a first-year MBA student whose grandmother had lost her entire retirement savings to David's scheme. Maria's presence in my classroom represented both the human cost of financial crime and the possibility of preventing future victims through education. Can anyone tell me the warning signs that might indicate a colleague is involved in financial fraud? I asked. Hands shot up across the auditorium. Students offered answers drawn from case studies we'd analyzed: lifestyle inflation without corresponding income increases, secretive behavior around financial transactions, pressure to move money quickly without proper documentation. Excellent observations, I said. Now let me tell you about someone who displayed all those warning signs while living in my home for 17 years. The room fell silent as I began describing David's gradual transformation from ethical businessman to criminal conspirator. I'd learned to tell this story without emotion, focusing on the observable behaviors that any trained professional should have recognized. The most dangerous criminals aren't the obvious ones, I continued. They're the charming, successful people who make you want to trust them. Madison Sterling was brilliant, beautiful, and completely convincing. She fooled veteran investigators, experienced executives, and even the man she was supposedly in love with. A student raised her hand. Professor Hayes, how do we protect ourselves from that kind of manipulation? Capitul mise, nieben tricking me for element and I before. By understanding that manipulation works by exploiting our desires and insecurities. David wanted to believe Madison loved him because it made his criminal behavior feel romantic rather than purely greedy. I wanted to believe our marriage was solid because questioning it would have meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The Hayes Institute had already prevented 3 potential fraud schemes in its first year of operation. Alumni of our program had reported suspicious behavior at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and a major Chicago pension fund, leading to investigations that stopped criminal activity before investors were harmed. More importantly, we were changing the culture of financial services. Students graduated with a deep understanding that their fiduciary responsibility to clients wasn't just a legal obligation, it was a moral imperative that protected the life savings of teachers, firefighters, and retirees. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet Rodriguez. Congressional hearing on financial fraud prevention wants your testimony next month. They're considering legislation based on the Hayes Institute model. As class ended and students filed out, discussing case studies and ethical dilemmas, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before David's betrayal: genuine pride in work that made the world measurably better. The program that had grown from my personal devastation was now protecting other families from experiencing similar betrayals. David and Madison had created victims. I was creating guardians. 5 years after that humid August morning when Madison Sterling sat in my living room announcing her plans to steal my life, I stood on the terrace of my new office building, watching the Chicago skyline paint itself in sunset colors. The Hayes Institute had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. 15 universities now offered our curriculum, and Congress had passed the Financial Ethics Protection Act based on our research. My reflection in the window showed a woman transformed. The naive wife who'd trusted blindly had been replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from building systems that protected others from experiencing similar betrayals. My assistant knocked softly on the door. "Mrs. Hayes, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." Madison Sterling stood in my waiting room, looking older than her 26 years. Federal prison had stripped away her polished veneer, leaving someone who appeared genuinely humbled by 5 years of consequences. She'd been released 6 months early for exemplary behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations. "Avery," she said quietly, as I gestured for her to follow me into my office. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I studied her face, searching for traces of the manipulative young woman who'd destroyed so many lives. What I saw was different: exhaustion, genuine remorse, and something that might have been wisdom earned through suffering. "What do you want, Madison?" "To apologize. But more than that." She pulled out a thick folder. "I've spent 5 years documenting everything I remember about Kellerman's network, contacts, methods, victims we never identified. I want to help you prevent others from following my path." I accepted the folder, noting how her hands trembled slightly. "Why now?" "Because I've had 5 years to understand what I really did. Not just to you or David, but to Maria Santos's grandmother, to the Chicago teachers who lost their pensions, to families whose children couldn't attend college because their education funds disappeared." Her voice broke. "I destroyed innocent people's futures to buy designer handbags." The Madison Sterling sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the confident young woman who'd announced her plans to inherit my husband's wealth. Prison had taught her something the business school never could: that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the actor. "What are your plans now?" "I'm working at a legal aid clinic in Milwaukee, helping fraud victims navigate the recovery process. Minimum wage, but it's honest work." She paused. "I know I can never undo what I did, but maybe I can help repair some of the damage." After Madison left, I sat with her documentation spread across my desk. The information she'd provided could help investigators track down millions in additional stolen assets, potentially returning money to victims who'd given up hope of recovery. My phone rang, a call from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, my former therapist who'd become a friend and collaborator. "Avery, I just heard about Madison Sterling's visit. How are you processing it?" "Strangely well," I admitted. 5 years ago, I wanted her to suffer for what she'd done. Today, I'm more interested in what she can contribute to preventing future crimes. That's growth. Revenge keeps you tied to the past. Justice moves you toward the future. As darkness fell over Chicago, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. David had lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, his wife. Madison had spent 5 years in federal prison, and would spend decades more earning redemption through service to others. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was the hundreds of students who'd learned to recognize financial fraud, the legislation that protected investors, the systems that prevented other families from experiencing the betrayal that had once shattered my world. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for something far more meaningful than what was destroyed. David and Madison had thought they were stealing my future. Instead, they'd given me a purpose I never could have discovered any other way. The woman who'd stood frozen in her kitchen that August morning, watching her world collapse, had been reborn as someone who protected others from similar destruction. That transformation was worth more than any revenge. It was worth everything. True power isn't measured by what you can take from others, but by what you can build to protect them. The trust that was meant to punish betrayal had evolved into something far more valuable: a legacy of justice that would outlast any individual crime. As Eleanor Matthews had understood decades before, the greatest victories come not from controlling wealth, but from using wisdom earned through suffering to build something worthy of the sacrifices made to preserve it. In the end, David and Madison had given me exactly what I deserved: not the comfortable life they'd tried to steal, but the meaningful one I'd built from its ashes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.